Hello everyone, I am back with another video, today doing a very special video response to a good friend of mine, and a long overdue one. My friend Blinkum recorded a video about 2 years ago talking about the 10 most memorable and meaningful games to him over the course of his life. And so I'm going to be taking a similar approach in terms of the games that I selected for his top 10, but it's important to note that this is not the traditional top 10 favorite or best games you've ever played. There's a unique spin on this in the sense that when I think of the games that are most meaningful to me, it's not necessarily correlated to what I consider the best games I've ever played. And what I mean by that is over the course of my life, there's been games that have met me at very specific points in my life, and they connect with me for very specific reasons. It could have been I was down in the dumps and just really going through some hard stuff, and I played this giant open world RPG, and that sense of escapism really helped me to get out of that difficult time. Or it could just be during very formative years of my life, I was playing games that I look back on very fondly. So that is really the crux of this topic and for this video, but I'm so excited to get behind the mic and share these 10 games with you because I have some deeply personal stories associated with these games that I've, in some cases, never shared publicly, certainly have never shared on YouTube before. So I think it's going to make for, again, a deeply personal video, but hopefully a video where you come away really with a lot of great game recommendations spanning a variety of generations and certainly a lot of different game consoles. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into game number 1. Now, I should also say before getting into these games, I haven't necessarily ordered these from my favorite to least favorite, but I did try and structure the list around kind of chronologically when these games came into my life from the earliest to more recently. And so the first game I have to show, one of my favorite 3D platformers ever, and that is Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage on the PlayStation 1. And I also have my original PS1 Slim here as well that I played this game on. The age-old question of if your house is burning down and you had to select a few things from your game room, what are you grabbing? These two things would be at the top of the list. And Spyro 2 kind of came into my life at a really interesting time. It was not long after my parents had gone through a divorce. I was about 8 years old, and my mom was oftentimes working a couple of different jobs growing up to kind of provide for my sister and I. And so she'd pick us up from school, we'd come home, she'd cook us dinner, and then she'd go back to one of her evening shifts. And so my sister and I would kind of try and finish our homework as quickly as we could so that we could go to the couch, turn on Spyro 2, among many other games on the PlayStation 1, and play this game. And she'd almost kind of coach me through some of the levels, and I just have incredibly fond memories playing this game alongside her. And what I love about Spyro 2, and really the entirety of that trilogy, is it has this kind of playful innocence to it. It reminds me a lot of cartoons that you might see on PBS Kids like Dragon Tales or some of the 90s Nickelodeon cartoons. Just a colorful, memorable cast of characters like Hunter, Moneybag, Zoe, Sparks the Dragon, of course Spyro himself. And being an Insomniac game, there's even some subtle innuendos that when the characters are speaking to one another that remind you a little bit of the Ratchet & Clank games that they would go on to develop. But as much as I love stuff like Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, DK64, it was really Spyro 2 that I think solidified my love of 3D platformers because I'd gotten to an age where I could kind of distinguish the difference between games and some of the mechanics in one genre versus another. And Spyro 2, I loved how each level kind of had this task that you had to do for a particular character to save them from the invading bad guys, and at the end they'd thank you, a little portal would open, you could go back to the hub world, but ultimately there was a ton of additional things to do in each level. One of the main things being collecting as many rupees or all of the rupees that you could. And so this really kickstarted my completionist mentality with trophies eventually on the PlayStation side of things, but more than anything with 3D platformers, because I would scour every square inch of these levels trying to find all of the different rupees so that, you know, Moneybags would eventually just take them all so you could continue to kind of progress the game. But again, it just really kind of solidified my love of the genre And at a very young age, as I look back on it, I think also helped me to cope with something, this separation between my parents that at the time I really couldn't fully wrap my head around or understand. But this game kind of helped me to cope during that difficult time, escape into these worlds and the levels, and interact with some very playful, memorable characters that again reminded me of something I was probably watching on Nickelodeon at the time. So Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, my favorite of the trilogy. I think all three are great games, and I think the Reignited trilogy is certainly the best way to play them today. And as someone who recently had a child of my own, I cannot wait to one day introduce her to these games that mean so much to me and were such a pivotal series that introduced me to not just games in general, but certainly 3D platformers. So Spyro 2, definitely one of the most meaningful games to me. Now, the next game on my list, I don't have a physical copy because it is actually an arcade game. And interestingly enough, so my mom is a hairstylist. She's a hairdresser. She has been for the entirety of her life. And so oftentimes when she wouldn't leave work to go back and my sister and I would stay at home, she would pick us up from school and we'd go directly to her salon. And I have very fond memories of this because the salon was in this strip mall, and just a few doors down from her shop, there was a Donato's Pizza, and then there was also, many moons ago, a card shop where we would go and look at Pokemon cards, and occasionally my mom would give us some money to buy some of those. Now, in addition to that, there was a laundromat just next to the salon. And so there were two arcade machines that I remember being there, one of which was the Die Hard trilogy, which I had quite a bit of fun playing at a very young age. But the one that really I have the fondest memories with playing with my sister is The Simpsons arcade. That game by Konami that nowadays I've played it, doesn't necessarily hold up. It is a very bare bones beat 'em up side scroller by Konami, but the number of times that my sister and I would rush into that laundromat, so much so that the owner of it knew my sister and I by name and knew exactly why we were in there, because we'd be running in with a giant bag of quarters to play that game, and we would just tear through quarters like there was no tomorrow, because back then Konami and the other developers of those arcade games knew how to ensure that they were getting as much money as possible. But playing that game with my sister was just such a blast, and I remember the number of times that one of us would have died, the other one was trying to continue and stay alive for as long as possible. We'd run back into the salon and say, Mom, we need more quarters, because we wanted to continue to get to the end of the game. I don't think we actually ever managed to do it, but my gosh, I can't even quantify the amount of money that we burned through playing that game. But again, similar to my story with Spyro 2, it was just an escape for my sister and I. We didn't really want to be in the salon. We'd probably much rather be at home. But that laundromat playing that arcade game was just a really, I think, fun kind of coping mechanism for us, a fun escape. And my gosh, we had such a good time playing it, and was a great introduction for me to The Simpsons. I also have very fond memories of asking for the DVD sets for Christmas, and each Christmas my mom would get me a new season of The Simpsons. And so with each passing year, I would just watch and rewatch each of those DVDs over and over and over again to kind of complement my time playing the arcade game with my sister. And now anytime I go into a 16-bit arcade or some neighboring mom and pop arcade that I might find around town, if there is a Simpsons arcade, I play it every single time, and I always snap a picture and send it to my sister, my mom, just to kind of highlight that memory playing it as a kid. So again, not a game you'd probably expect to see on this list, but is a very meaningful and memorable one to me. Now, next up, I actually have two games. I could not separate these two. I had to kind of keep them together. The first of which is Hot Shots Golf Open T on the PlayStation Portable, the PSP. The next one might surprise folks. It is Madden 2003 with Marshall Faulk of the Los Angeles Rams, at that point the St. Louis Rams. Madden 2003. The reason why I can't separate these games is because they are both tied to memories playing these games with my dad. The first of which is Madden 2003. And the reason why I want to call out this game is because it not only solidified my love of watching NFL football and playing Madden and college football games, but I was at such a young age when this game came out, my dad being a huge fan of the Rams, and I remember sitting downstairs in my basement, and my dad would be calling plays next to me. I'd be cycling through all the different plays on the screen, and he would be telling me, Rusty, run this play, run that play, given the where I was at on the field, the teams that I was playing in franchise mode, and I would execute the plays and play the game using the controller. And so it was this really incredible bonding moment with my dad, and that eventually translated to going outside and my dad passing me the football day in, day out. After school, we were either downstairs playing Madden or I was outside and he was throwing me the football. Tens of thousands of footballs my dad has thrown me, so much so that every single Sunday, I personally am a huge fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers now. He comes over, and before we watch the games, we go outside, we toss the football around. At halftime, we go outside, we toss the football around. It's such a great bonding thing for my dad and I. It solidified my love of football, and it just really deepened my relationship with my dad. And it's something that we still do today. I cherish it every time he comes over. And anytime I look at this game on the shelf, it reminds me of those times that I spent downstairs in the basement playing this game with my dad. And I have to also call this game out Hot Shots Golf Open Tee, because similarly, when I got my PSP and I got this game, I really enjoyed playing it. I introduced it to my dad because he always loved watching golf. And every time I came home from school, he was sitting there playing my PSP so much it got to the point I was like, Dad, you've got to get a PSP of your own because I want to play my PSP. And literally, the moment I told him that, he said, all right, let's get in the car. Let's go to GameStop. We went to GameStop. He got his own PSP. He got his own copy of Hot Shots Golf Open Tee. And for years, anytime we were on an airplane traveling to a vacation, we'd be playing local match play mode where we'd be playing against each other, or he would be playing on his own little campaign, upgrading his character with all the little outfits, and that eventually translated to getting Hot Shots Golf 3 and 4 on the PlayStation 2. The number of times I would come home, go downstairs in the basement, my dad was playing like an 18-hole tournament on Hot Shots Golf 3 or 4 on the PlayStation 2. It warmed my heart because it really introduced my dad to video games in a way that he had never really played before. And again, similar to Madden and kind of just deepening my relationship with my father, it also did that because we played this game together on the PSP. So I had to call out these two games together because they're meaningful to me for so many different reasons, but the most of which is because, again, I spent so much time playing these games with my dad. Now, next up is a game that is deeply personal to me because of the time I played it in my life, but that is Pokemon Platinum version on the Nintendo DS. Now, I grew up playing Pokemon Red on the Game Boy Color, and every subsequent Pokemon generation, this is by no means my favorite Pokemon generation by any stretch of the imagination. It'd probably be 1, 2, and 3 in that order. But the reason why Platinum is so special to me is because when I was in 8th grade, I was actually diagnosed with an eating disorder. And for the next several years, I was going to a tremendous amount of therapy and getting help for that. But when I was a sophomore in high school, I had relapsed pretty bad. And I was hospitalized at Nationwide Children's for 13 days. And at the end of that hospital stay, I was actually sent to a treatment facility in Wisconsin for about 2 months. And I missed the first 2 months of my junior year of high school. And it was an incredibly isolating time, very scary time, because I was sent to this place surrounded by people that were also struggling with this disease. And I only got one phone call a day, and it was to my parents in the evenings, and I was just kind of almost forced to embrace recovery from this thing that I was struggling with. And the only thing that I really had at the time to really escape from this reality that I found myself in was my Nintendo DS. And I remember being in the hospital for those 13 days, and they had a pile of VHS tapes that you could kind of almost rent and bring back to your room. And they had old Pokemon Season 1 tapes that I was able to rent and watch. And so I remember watching those when I was, again, 16-year-old kid and playing Pokemon Platinum. I couldn't tell you a single thing about the story in Pokemon Platinum. I couldn't tell you what my party was. But what I can tell you is that whether I was in the hospital or whether I was in this treatment facility for those 2 months and beginning to kind of be rehabilitated and kind of come back to who I was prior to being so deep in my depression and lost in this disease, Pokemon Platinum was that game that, as much as the therapy and the men that I was there with kind of trying to embrace recovery with helped me to overcome this thing that I was struggling with, Pokemon Platinum was also something that helped to pull me out of this dark hole that I was in. And I think everyone in some capacity who's played games for the great majority of their life can relate to being in a difficult time. Maybe you can't necessarily relate to the thing that I was going through or the thing that I was struggling with, but I think everyone goes through difficult times in their life, and they can probably point to a game or a handful of games that really helped you to get through that experience or get through that breakup or that job loss or whatever it is. And my gosh, if there's ever a thing that I can point to and say, there's power in video games, it is Pokemon Platinum. Because again, I couldn't tell you much about the game, but I know that it helped me get through one of the most difficult times of my life. And thank God, literally, that I've come out of that experience. I've embraced recovery. I'm doing much better today. And as much as I can point to that treatment facility, those doctors, those therapists that helped me to get through that experience, I can also point to Pokemon Platinum as being a very pivotal game to help pull me out of that very, very dark place in my life. So I had to highlight this. I wanted to share that story, not for sympathy or anything like that, but also to kind of just highlight that I'm just as much as a human as anyone else out there. We go through difficult things, and my gosh, games are so special in helping us to get through those difficult experiences. So Pokemon Platinum, thank you for that. Pokemon in general, just thank you for just being there for all of us, right, at very different stages of our life. So had to highlight this game as one of the most meaningful games in my life. Now, enough of the dark and scary. We need a little bit of a palate cleanser, and maybe no better game to act as a palate cleanser than Dragon Quest V: Hand of the Heavenly Bride on the Nintendo DS. A series that I continually go back to when I just need a comfort food RPG to play and get lost in. And Dragon Quest V especially, I think, is a very unique one. And I'll do my best to kind of tiptoe around spoilers, but I do kind of want to give some general context to the story because I think it's important to kind of showcase why this game means so much to me. And the first of which is, when I went to college, I kind of made a deal with myself, if you will, that each year I was in college, I was going to play a different Dragon Quest game on the DS. And so my freshman year, I played 4. Sophomore year, I played 5, 6, eventually 9. But 5, when I played it, I didn't really know what to expect. I thought, like, okay, turn-based battles, Akira Toriyama character art, all of that kind of stuff. What I could have never expected is just how different the story is than any of the other Dragon Quest games. And in the very beginning, you're playing as this very young boy, and over the course of the game, you almost see each of the different chapters of this young boy's life as he becomes a teenager, a man. You eventually get to choose the person you marry, you have children. And as things happen very early in this young boy's life that are very tragic, you experience loss. Again, you fall in love, you have children of your own. And throughout all these different experiences, I think very much like in the real world, as you go through different experiences, whether it's trauma or loss or falling in love, you learn life lessons, and you have opportunities throughout the course of your life to right the wrongs of your past, or maybe teach your children the things that your parents didn't teach you. And I think Dragon Quest V handles a lot of those different topics very gracefully and very impactfully, and in a way that, again, it's not like there is any voice acting or full motion video to really drive home these more emotional story beats. It's all done in a very Dragon Quest traditional JRPG fashion, and yet it was still very moving for me, even when I was a sophomore in college. And I look back on this game very fondly, especially as someone who recently had a child of his own. My wife just welcomed our young daughter into the world. And so I'm thinking about a lot of those things that I was talking about, things that I learned with the way my parents taught me, how I want to raise my daughter and teach her. And Dragon Quest V really helps to kind of capture a lot of those life things in a really unique way and a very traditional JRPG setting. So it has all of the bells and whistles that you would expect in a Dragon Quest game, the turn-based combat. Akira Toriyama, God rest his soul, his artwork is on full display, but the story that's kind of baked into Dragon Quest V, I think, is what's so special and what certainly sets it apart from some of the other earlier Dragon Quest games. And it has my highest recommendation. The hardest thing nowadays is the barrier to entry from a price perspective. So hopefully someday, maybe on Switch 2, we get some type of trilogy remake or remaster of sorts for 4, 5, and 6. I think it would sell really well, especially with how well Dragon Quest has done here for mainstream audiences in the West nowadays. And my gosh, I'd love to replay this game nowadays as well. But that is one of the many reasons why it makes my list, because I have very fond memories going up into my bunk bed when I was in college on Friday and Saturday nights when everyone else was out partying it up. I was watching Avatar: The Last Airbender on my laptop and playing Dragon Quest V and grinding it out on my DS. So I look back on it very fondly, one of my favorite JRPGs of all time. Now, this next game might come across as a controversial take for some, but I think a lot of folks have really come around to liking this game, or at least looking back on it more fondly than they did at launch. And that is Final Fantasy XIII. Now, it's important to note that this was the first Final Fantasy game that I had ever completed, and really the first Final Fantasy game that I really ever sunk significant amount of time into. I played a little bit of 7 when I was a kid, but it just didn't really... It was not a game that I was ready to really take on. And so when I played 13, when it originally released, I immediately fell in love with it. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that. One, I didn't have any preconceived notions on what Final Fantasy should or needs to be. Like a lot of other folks who grew up playing 6, 7, 8, and 9, and when they played 13, it's too linear, it's not enough this, it's too much that. I went in with eyes wide open, again, not knowing what to expect. So when I was introduced to characters like Lightning and Saz with a little baby chocobo in his hair, and what I consider a very extended, memorable cast of characters, I was immediately intrigued, not to mention what I consider one of the best battle systems of any JRPG I personally have ever played in the Paradigm system. A lot of folks kind of chalk it up to be, you're on the sidelines, it's very mindless, there's no strategy to it. If that's your opinion of the Paradigm system, that it's just mindless and it's just auto-battling all the time, you didn't make it deep enough into Final Fantasy. I think it's one of the most nuanced and complex battle systems in a Final Fantasy game, and there's a tremendous amount of strategy to it, especially as you get into some of those end of chapter bosses in chapters 10, 11, 12, and eventually the final 13th chapter. And it also has one of my, if not favorite, leveling up systems in the Crystarium system. Whenever I would go to the menu and figure out my my party of characters and how much CP they had, clicking into each individual character and their different classes and holding that button to see each subsequent stat line be completed and that crystal kind of fully formed and just continuing to kind of rotate around. So addicting, supremely satisfying, and it made grinding so much more fun, in my opinion, because I wanted to continue to get back to that Crystarium screen and level up each of my characters. Now, I'll be the first to admit, the story is a bunch of nonsense. I don't know what the hell is going on half the time. You have the LC, the Fal'C, the Lacey, the Pulse C, it is ridiculous.
What?
That's a Pulse brand. That girl's a Lassie.
I already told you that.
Pulse Lassie are the enemies of Cocoon.
PSICOM. Private Sanctum troops, not the Guardian Corps.
PSICOM, Guardian Corps. Soldiers are soldiers, aren't they?
The Purge is PSICOM's baby. Our military is split into two arms. The Public Security and Intelligence Command, known as PSICOM, and the Guardian Corps. I was Guardian Corps, Bodum Security Regiment.
Wait, but I don't get it.
But you know what? Kingdom Hearts is one of my favorite series of all time, and I also have no idea what's going on in those games from a story side of things either. I think the core gameplay, the cast of characters, and my god, the music, the soundtrack to this game, everything else is so amplified that it not having this very digestible, clear-cut, comprehensible story isn't a reason for me not to like this game, let alone the linearity that everyone seems to have an opinion about. The same people that seem to love 10 hate on 13 for being linear. I only played the first 10 to 15 hours of Final Fantasy X, but that game is also tremendously linear. So I think with this series, first of all, the internet tends to be more negative than positive nowadays, but I think with the Final Fantasy series in particular, folks seem to find more reasons to hate on each subsequent release instead of finding one or two gameplay mechanics or characters or story or music that really speaks to them or resonates with them. And 13 is one of those games that you're seeing it now. A lot of people are kind of coming out from the darkness and are saying, yeah, Final Fantasy 13 is actually a pretty good game. And when it came out, I don't know if people were just afraid to say something positive because there was so much overwhelming negativity surrounding it or something like that. You're seeing it a lot. You saw it a lot with 15, which I personally love that game as well, and certainly 16 as well. I know a lot of good friends of mine didn't even finish it because it was so against what they deemed to be Final Fantasy, which I get, okay? Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, certainly. But with 13, a lot more people are coming around to it, and I think for good reason, because I think there's an incredible game underneath a ridiculous story, the linear nature of the first 20 to 25 hours. And again, the soundtrack alone is worth sticking around for an additional 5 to 10 hours. Let alone, I think it's very satisfying and addicting combat system that is very fun to master. There are very few strategy guides that I still keep around. I have the entire trilogy of the 13 strategy guides because I think they're almost essential to deeper in the game to just thumb through and understand the different ways you should kind of customize your party and the paradigm system and the classes that you need to continue to shift to during those more difficult boss battles. And 13-2 is another favorite of mine. Very eclectic mix of music. I loved how they took the Pokemon monster collecting mechanic and kind of blended that with the paradigm system. 13-3 or Lightning Returns, I'm less of a fan of, but I've also not finished that game, so I need to go back to it eventually. But 13 especially, incredible. One of, if not my favorite Final Fantasy games ever. 13-2 is also special, but the most meaningful and memorable to me is certainly 13, and that's why it had to make my list.
That was close.
Gorgeous. Our own private heaven.
Now, it would not be an Ari Lewis 2011 list without showing some open world Western RPG, some love. And I thought about this a lot, and I still hold firmly to this opinion that I prefer this game over the next one in the mainline series. That is the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, my original platinum hits or whatever they called it on the 360 copy. And what's really interesting about this game, you think of kind of that age-old question of what's a game that you put down because you didn't like it, and then you came back to it maybe years later, and it really struck a chord with you, or resonated with you, and you fell in love with it? Oblivion is that classic example. I remember going over to a friend's house and him saying, Rusty, you love Lord of the Rings. You will not believe the game that I recently picked up on the 360. It's the reason to own this console. We went down in his basement. He put the controller in my hands, and I was just wandering around this world, and it just felt weird and clunky. I didn't like that it was in first person, but I was like, all right, you know what? I'll give this a try. I went to Best Buy later that weekend with my dad. I bought this copy of my own. I went home. I started my own character, and I just didn't get it. It didn't make sense to me. It just didn't feel right. And so I still held on to my copy, this copy right here. And about a year or so later, I was like, let's give this another try. There's something about this game clearly that has resonated with people. It's a long-running The Elder Scrolls series franchise, Morrowind before it. People love it. I've got to figure it out. And I created a character, and I played it for 3 to 5 hours, and just something triggered in my brain. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is Lord of the Rings come to life in video game form. This is one of the greatest immersive fantasy adventures that you'll ever play in video games. The vibrant, colorful world. You talk about classic openings like Breath of the Wild when you come out of that cave and you see this vast, expansive world that you can go anywhere and explore. Todd Howard is famous for saying, yep, over there, you can go climb that mountain. You can go to this area in the world. That moment when you see the sewer gates and you walk out of it, and then you see this vibrant, colorful, high contrast world that you now have to your disposal, and you can go anywhere you want and freely explore with that classic Jeremy Soule soundtrack that is very ambient and immersive in nature. I lost dozens of hours of my life in late high school, early college, finally sinking my teeth into the world of Oblivion. And to this day, I still kind of hold it above Skyrim, mainly because it's just much more of a colorful world to explore, where Skyrim is very dark and dreary and gray. Oblivion, again, is much brighter, lively, and colorful. But going into its many copy-paste dungeons, continuing to close the Oblivion gates and finish the main story, not to mention its many side faction quests like Thieves Guild, Mage, and the Dark Brotherhood. I've done it all except the Mage Guild. That's like the final achievements that I've not completed on my Xbox 360 profile. I still need to do that, but just about everything else I've completed. And again, one of the most immersive games I've ever played, one of my favorite RPGs ever, and certainly one of the most meaningful games to me because of that time. I retreated to my bedroom in high school. I took my Xbox 360 to college and played it in my dorm room. Such memorable memories playing this incredible game, and it made my excitement and the hype leading up to Skyrim that much greater because of the time I sunk into, again, the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, one of my absolute favorites. Now we're getting into some games that I played a little bit more recently, and this next one is a game that came out in 2020. which I think many consider or at least I do, a nightmare of a year for a variety of reasons. Obviously, COVID hit and there was just social unrest. It was a rough year for a lot of us, and I could very easily point to something like Animal Crossing New Horizons on the Nintendo Switch that I thoroughly enjoyed, put well over 100 hours into with my wife and my friends at the time when we were all stuck in our houses and apartments, quarantined, isolated from the rest of the world. But there was another game that I played for the very first time. It was a remaster of a game that originally came out on the Wii, a game that many of us over here in the West never thought we'd get, but maybe thanks to Operation Rainfall, maybe they always had plans to bring it over. That is Xenoblade Chronicles, the definitive edition on the Nintendo Switch. And my goodness, kind of similar to something like Oblivion, Skyrim, The Witcher 3 is another game I could have easily put on this list here because I also played that in 2020. But what an open world to explore in this game. Talk about nuanced combat systems, something that can be very off-putting for people when they originally play it. Kind of with this hotbar at the bottom, this MMO-like system that you kind of have to get used to. And it took me a little time to get used to the combat system and how this game really worked. My gosh, when it did, and it clicked, and I was running through the fields of Gower Plains. I don't know how you pronounce it. It doesn't really matter. But the music that plays there, the giant monsters that are running across that field that you interact in, have to fight. And the story that is very anime-like, a very colorful cast of characters, Shulk being the main protagonist, using the Minato blade in combat. You know, I couldn't really say that it's the story that resonated with me as much as something like, you know, Final Fantasy 13 or something like The Last of Us or Uncharted or anything like that. The story is not what I look back on Xenoblade most fondly. It really is the world and the music and how immersive it was, and how you talk about escapism and the need to escape in the year 2020 into games, whether it was TV shows, movies, whatever medium, music that you needed to really find peace of mind and comfort during that very difficult time for everyone literally in the world. Xenoblade Chronicles was that game. That was that open world. The music, the characters, the combat system that I lost myself and immersed myself in. And I just remember sitting on the couch, my wife by my side, my dog on my lap, just continuing to pump tens and dozens of hours into that game, into that world. And again, I look back on that very fondly, and anytime I listen to the Xenoblade Chronicles soundtrack, I am reminded of sitting on that blue couch that we had in that second apartment before we moved into our house, playing this game, getting near the end. I did not roll credits actually in 2020, even though it made it to my top 10 games of the year list. It wasn't until a year and a half later that I rolled credits because there was a boss that was just kicking my butt. I didn't feel like grinding at the time, and I was ready to just kind of shelve the game. But I came back to it, we rolled credits, we finished it, and now 4 years later, I am deep into Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and it's also meeting me where I'm at in my life, going through the newborn stage of being a parent, and I have no doubt that Reby Flats and some of the other very memorable songs in Xenoblade 3 I'll look back on more fondly years down the road, thinking about those first couple of weeks and months with my daughter and the diaper changes. Similarly, I look back on the Xenoblade Chronicles 1 soundtrack and Colony 6 and 9, and I love how that has the day-night cycle, and the music shifts and changes based on that as well. I know I'm going to look back fondly playing Xenoblade 3 just as much as I do Xenoblade Chronicles. It's an incredible JRPG, one of my absolute favorites, and very meaningful and memorable to me because it helped me cope and deal and find comfort and peace during a very difficult and challenging time during all of our lives in 2020. Now, speaking of 2020, during that time, I also had a small stint streaming on Twitch, and I enjoyed playing a number of different games, one of which being Donkey Kong Country, and if you followed along for those streams, I've uploaded the VODs to my channel here. A lot of memorable times playing that. Heavy Rain was another one that I really enjoyed playing with an audience and friends watching me. But there was one game that I really think helped to capture my entire time streaming on Twitch. It's not only the most memorable stream I ever had, but it's also one of the most meaningful and memorable games that I've ever played. And it took me a long time to get around to playing it. I remember folks talking about it back in, I believe, 2012 when it first released, that it was one of the most moving game experiences you could ever play. And that is that game company's Journey. And I certainly found out in that 2 hours of playing it why people hold it in such high regard. And it was a game that I really kind of had to come down from. I remember walking away from the stream and really just processing and reflecting on the game experience. And I also recorded a podcast with some good friends of mine, Blink and Frantic, who record the Indie Quest podcast, and we talked for well over an hour about the game and why it meant so much to us. And there's something that really stuck out to me about Blink's experience reflecting on it and the things that he had to say about it. And what he had to say is that just as much in the game that it's best experienced playing alongside a partner, so much more is life itself that much more precious and special when you're going through it with a loved one or several folks that you love and care for. And I think that is what's so special as I reflect on my time playing that game. Sure, the gameplay is fun, but it's very simple. And there's no words, there's no speaking, there's no real cutscenes to speak of. You're kind of just going from A to B. The very beginning of the game is you kind of wake up and you're in this deserted area playing as this character, and eventually you might come across a wandering traveler, someone that in my stream I referred to as my little friend. And just as much in life, if you fall in love with someone or you have parents that you really care for or siblings, the thought of losing them is like almost suffocating, right? You couldn't even imagine, if you have a life partner, not continuing to live life with them. And the way this game so quickly creates those feelings of fear of losing that person you're going on this journey with is difficult to put into words, but that is what this game did for me, and it did it so quickly. And I had an incredible group of friends, Pete Dorr being one of them, Blink being another, and several others watching me go through this game experience. And the number of times I was fearful that I was going to lose my little friend because I was paying too much attention to the Twitch chat, or I had wandered too far from that person, they wandered too far from me, but they were patient with me just as much as I was patient with them, just as much as I try to be as patient with my life partner, my wife, nowadays. And I feel like the game is a great metaphor for that. And without spoiling the experience for anyone else, because if you've not played it, I think it's an absolute must. I think it's like playing Mario 64, The Last of Us, The Walking Dead Season 1, so many other games that I could point to. I think Journey is one of those top 10 must-play games. It is certainly a top 10 favorite game of all time for me. Certainly one of the most meaningful games to me. A very emotional experience, but my gosh, what a special one it is. And Austin Wintory perfectly scores the game. He, of course, has done other games like Abzu and Erica. He actually scored Assassin's Creed Syndicate, a great Assassin's Creed game. But Journey, my goodness, what a memorable 2 hours that was. 2 hours that I will never forget. I actually have the VOD of me playing it here on YouTube, and surprisingly enough, it is one of my most clicked on or watched videos. It's got like over 10,000 views, and it's really interesting to read the comment section, because once you finish this game, it's almost like all you want to do is not replay it, but watch others go through it, because it really is one of those things that you don't really want to or need to play more than once, but you still want to see the experience through someone else's eyes. And so if that's your thing, you can check out the VOD. I'll have a link down below. But Journey, one of my favorite games of all time, certainly one of the most meaningful to me. Now, last but certainly not least, if you've been a longtime follower of the channel, you were probably waiting for this game to show up. I played it much earlier in my life, so chronologically it doesn't make sense, but I feel like it's only appropriate that I save this game for last. This is my favorite game of all time, my favorite game on the PS2, certainly the most meaningful game to me in my life. And that is Kingdom Hearts 1 on the PlayStation 2. This is actually one of my best friends growing up, his copy. Well, I did not discover the game at his house. I discovered it at his neighbor's house and also one of my best friends, Scott. This is my buddy Ryan's copy, but it was actually probably at his house before I had a copy of my own that I watched him play this game the most, again, before I picked up my copy, a greatest hits version, at Target when I was about 10 years old. And why Kingdom Hearts is so special to me is I grew up in the 90s watching the VHS tapes of what I considered the golden era of Disney: The Lion King, Aladdin, Hercules, Mulan, Beauty and the Beast, among so many others. So when I did go down to my friend Scott's basement house, or in Scott's basement, and I saw his older brothers playing Kingdom Hearts, and I saw these anime-like characters fighting alongside Peter Pan and Hercules and some of these other Disney characters that I was very aware of and I loved because I enjoyed the movies that they were tied to. I was just very intrigued, but I didn't really understand what the game was. And so it was at Ryan's house where I watched him play the game that I thought, I need to play this. Because while I didn't understand the Final Fantasy references when Cloud and other characters came onto the scene, I was very aware when I saw all of the Disney characters captured in this RPG. And I could really point back to Kingdom Hearts as maybe kickstarting my love of JRPGs, because before that, certainly I played Pokemon, but I could never really wrap my head around stuff like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest at that time of my life. But there's really only 2 games over the course of my life that my mom literally had to prevent me or put limits on playing because I was just non-stop right after school, skipping homework, skipping meals, because all I wanted to do was get back into the world of Kingdom Hearts, playing Sora, running around those famous Disney worlds with my friends Donald and Goofy and its other side characters that you could fight alongside. Kingdom Hearts, you couldn't pull me away from, and even to this day, you could see, well, you can't really see captured in this shot. My brother-in-law has a beautiful giant Kingdom Hearts painting that he painted for me, hanging on my wall. I have an entire shrine of Kingdom Hearts stuff over there to really showcase my love of the series. But what's interesting about Kingdom Hearts, in the same way as I spoke about Final Fantasy 13, is half the time I don't know what the hell is going on because it's so convoluted and ridiculous. But what was special about the first game is that it was pretty contained in its lore, and it wasn't introducing too much nonsense. You didn't have decimal points and fractions in the title. It was just this really great marriage between Disney and Squaresoft, and they created an RPG that on paper wouldn't make any sense to people. So the fact that it even got greenlit is a miracle. And since then, we've seen how many spin-off titles, 3 mainline games. The 4th game we'll probably see when my daughter goes to college, so I'm looking forward to that in about 2042. But Kingdom Hearts has stood the test of time from a serious standpoint. Gameplay, the first game, a little rough. The platforming sucks. And sometimes you don't know where the hell you're supposed to go in places like Wonderland and Deep Jungle. But I still look back very fondly playing Kingdom Hearts because I would take a little 10-inch CRT TV and hook it up in my mom's salon after school and play the game there. I would take my PS2 back home and play it when we got home after we finished dinner. When I woke up on the weekends, the first thing I did was turn on my PlayStation 2 and play Kingdom Hearts. I lived and breathed that game for many years. To this day, I still look back on it very fondly because it is my favorite game of all time. And again, it is certainly the most meaningful game in my life. I know it's not for everyone, but it certainly is for me as someone who grew up watching the heck out of Disney VHS tapes, and so much of my channel has centered around Disney related content, whether it was my top 10 Disney movies back in the day or showcasing my VHS tape collection. And my goodness, Kingdom Hearts. I love you. So many other people do. Kingdom Hearts 4, Tetsuya Nomura, put down the other projects. Let's just wrap up Kingdom Hearts 4 so I can finally play that game. But one of my favorite games of all time, and for very good reason.
Well, you know, after running restaurant.
I guess you're stuck with us, Sora.
Thanks a lot, Donald. Goofy.
How will you fight without a weapon?
I know now I don't need the Keyblade. I've got a better weapon. My heart.
Your heart? What good will that weak little thing do for you?
Although my heart may be weak, it's not alone. It's grown with each new experience, and it's found a home with all the friends I've made. I've become part of their heart just as they've become a part of mine. And if they think of me now and then, if they don't forget me, then our hearts will be one. I don't need a weapon. My friends are my power.
All right, everyone, this has been a long video, but I definitely did not want to gloss over or quickly rush through this list because, again, these games are deeply personal to me. They are the most meaningful games in my life for a variety of different reasons, as you've seen over the course of this video. But I would love to hear from you down in the comment section below. What are some of the most meaningful games to you? Not necessarily your favorites, but games that just met you where you were at different points in your life that you look back on very fondly. I'd love to hear from you down below, or if you want to do a video response, I'd also love to hear from you in that way as well. But I want to thank you all so much for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one.